Welcome to the 16th DEM I Wonder webinar. DEM has so many services, offerings, programs, and hidden gems that we want to share with all of you. So we're excited to take just a few minutes each week to highlight these features in our weekly webinar. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, many exercises have been postponed or canceled. The Utah Division of Emergency Management is hosting this weekly webinar series aimed at providing local emergency managers with relevant content and opportunities to enhance their capabilities. Webinars will be live for Q&A and will be recorded for later viewing on the DEM website and YouTube channel. Most of these webinars will be seminars or workshops with a hands-on portion which will allow emergency managers to become oriented to a DEM process or test a DEM product. Our schedule today will be as follows. We'll start with our ground rules and etiquette. Next, we'll have a brief presentation by Jana Wilkinson on I Wonder Why We Do Damage Assessments. Following the presentation, there will be a hands-on portion where participants will be encouraged to test out the product or process that was presented. Following the hands-on portion of our program, the presenter will be available for a Q&A session. Following the Q&A, we will close with a short message about upcoming webinars. The ground rules today are fairly simple. Please mute your line while the presenter is presenting. If you have a question, you may type it in the group chat or unmute at the appropriate time to ask your question. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website for future viewing. Thank you all for your attendance today. And with that, we'll turn the time over to Jana Wilkinson.
Thank you, Tracy. Get the screen over to my computer. Okay. So damage assessments and why we do them. I'm going to spend a few slides just going over, I guess, answering that question. And then the last slide, I have several resources that I'm going to share with you on damage assessments, how to get information, tools that you can use, and we'll go through some of those resources and then do some activities of finding information. So to start out, why do we need to do preliminary damage assessments? We often get asked this because damage assessments happen in the middle of response operations. From the minute a disaster happens, you're reporting damages to multiple people on multiple different levels with multiple facts or pieces of data that have to be included, and people are asking for information all over the place. And so part of why we need to do it are some of the general reasons that at least our agency asks for you to provide your damage assessment information to the state is to provide information on the overall impact of the disaster on your community. How is it affecting you? Is it something you can handle? Is it something you need resources from someone else, another county, a state resource, or other things to come and help? And then also the long-term impacts, so we can see what damages might need some additional assistance to help recover from. Shows the need for resources. It also helps to support our request for federal assistance, and I'll go into a bit more about that a little bit later. But when we request assistance from a federal agency, we have to provide information on the impacts and on the overall damages to justify that request. And then it also helps to support your applications for any available grants and funding sources that do become available from federal or state resources later. So why do we have to provide so much information or certain types of information in your damage reports? So you get asked a lot of different types of information, and at the local level, you have to manage not only gathering information from different sources, but then providing it in different formats. And it can be challenging. I know, especially between our public assistance, individual assistance, SBA, those are the three main disaster declarations that my section at DEM works in. And public assistance is the assistance as the declaration has a threshold, so you have to meet that threshold for your county, and then the state has to meet the threshold for the state in order to request FEMA's public assistance program under a federal declaration. And those are calculated by dollar amounts. So what do you think it's going, what are the damages? How much was damaged in dollar estimates? And then we also have to factor out things like, well, if it was covered by insurance, it doesn't count towards the threshold. And so there are a lot of factors that go into public assistance. And then individual assistance is the opposite. So there is an individual assistance program through FEMA to help residents who have damages to their homes SBA also has programs to help with low interest business loans for residents and also for business owners for damages that they've had to their facilities. Businesses can get loans for economic impacts from disasters. Individual assistance also has several community programs that we can bring in, such as crisis counseling, case management, unemployment, um, disaster legal services, and all of those programs also have to be justified and have data to back them up. But they're not done on a dollar amount. They're done on an impact scale. And so for your public infrastructure, you're gathering and providing data in dollar amounts, whereas for the individual assistance and other programs, you're gathering information from residents, but it's more on a damage scale. So what level of damage is it destroyed? Are they just slightly impacted? So that they require different types of information and you're gathering it all at the same time. Unfortunately, we at the state, in order to request these programs and provide this information in our request, rely on you guys, our local emergency managers, the city administrators, all those that are working out in the field to gather the data, both for public damages and for residential damages, and feed that information up to us as we do that. Some of that we can do as you feed the information to the EOC. Other things the EOC doesn't gather or you don't provide to them, so we have to follow up with you and request that information in order to do that declaration. In our requests for disasters, we have to show needs for resources. Also at the state, we have to do that as well. That's why often if you request a resource from the state, sometimes they'll reach back and ask who you've already contacted, in part because as they're looking to find your resources, they don't want to duplicate efforts you've already done and then want to go up to the next step, which would be a state resource or a federal resource. And then third reason, which is, the less dynamic, but I guess heaviest one, is there are federal financial and disaster recovery program requirements. So there are requirements by law that we have to do damage assessments in order to request federal programs and to get federal funding. And we have to provide a certain level of detail, documentation, and justification in those damage assessments. And then the state also has the responsibility of verifying that the damages that are being reported to us are accurate, so that we've reviewed them and we know that, a local community is not just coming and handing us a napkin that says we had $2 million in damages with no context. Unfortunately, that comes because there's been a long history, not in Utah, but just in disaster history in general with these programs. Over the several decades they've been available, there's a history of fraud or misuse of funds, not always by local agencies or state agencies. That even goes down to the contractors that are used or people that are providing services to help out communities and states during disaster response. If you're getting a mitigation grant, or if any of you have worked in other programs that we have, there's not quite the minute information on documentation or your procurement policies, that all has to be provided at once. That's in part because it's not a public disaster, so there aren't a lot of people out there who are aware of an opportunity for fraud. And also with mitigation grants, it's not something you're doing urgently in the moment. It's a project or a thing you have time to plan out, provide the documentation over several years as your activities happen. With disasters, your activities are all happening at once. And so we need to capture that data in the moment. And then it also provides opportunities for contractors to gouge prices, to not provide services. And it is an unfortunate case of those few who have done that have unfortunately made it a bit harder for the rest of us with additional requirements that have been put in place. So I included some links on the bottom here. So if you're ever curious and really want some good bedtime reading, or if you're like me and you just like knowing the policies and the rules and the regulations and why we have to do it, the CFRs are the Code of Federal Regulations. When you're doing anything with federal grants, FEMA grants, disaster response, FEMA has guidance. The state also has state guidance we do for our fiscal programs. But the CFRs are basically the be-all, end-all legal law. So all of the guidance is based off of those. And any changes in those, because they are federal rules. So if you want to get to the why is it and what's the answer, and I need to know, the legal behind it, 2 CFR 200 is what talks about all federal grants and the requirements for any federal funding. And then the 44 CFR is what covers Homeland Security and FEMA and their responsibilities in disaster response. Okay, and then another question we often get as well is, why do we have to provide this information so quickly? So as we mentioned, we're often asking you for information or following up on data or damages while things are still happening within the first few days and weeks after a disaster. Part of that is we have to meet deadlines for state and local federal disaster declarations. So we help the governor's office draft the state disaster declarations. And in that declaration, we have to outline all of the reasons why it's a state disaster, what the damages are, how it's impacting the communities, why is it something that is creating a state of disaster. And then that declaration from the state is also used when we do our federal declarations. And so any information that we can put in there to say, this is why, because it's washing out roads, because it's impacting this many residents, helps us to justify that declaration. Deadlines we have, usually the state declarations happen within the first, depending on the disaster, but usually within the first 24 to 48 hours, we're working with the governor's office to get a state declaration drafted and published once we know some of the big impacts that happen right after the event. We also need that to justify federal declarations and then the recovery assistance programs. So when we do a federal declaration or request a federal disaster declaration, we have a 30-day deadline from the date the disaster happened to submit that federal disaster request. And that disaster request is a lot more complicated and more involved than the state declaration. So the state declaration is a document that has a lot of whereases that says, whereas this happened, these are the damages, these are the impacts, we've determined that we need to declare a state of emergency within the state. For the federal declaration, we have a template form that we fill out on public assistance and individual assistance and any other programs that we might want to request through FEMA. What assistance is it that we need? And why do we need that assistance? So when the damages come in, we can't just receive the damages, but we have to verify the damages are accurate. So that's why we don't just accept a lump sum of we've had this much in damages. We have to ask, well, where are you getting those numbers from? How are you calculating that? And then also that threshold for public assistance, as I mentioned before, is only for things that aren't covered by insurance or by other means. So we have to show not just that we had the damages, but that we don't have the resources or any funding or other things coming in to cover those resources, to cover those damages. Our earthquake declaration that we submitted for the Magna earthquake was 17 pages long, just describing the damages. So for public assistance, describe the damages and give dollar numbers. And then we also have to work with FEMA to verify that we've seen documentation and we know that those damages are real and accurate. And for individual assistance, there's the numbers of people impacted and the number of homes affected and the number of businesses. Then we also write up very extensive descriptions of how is the economy being impacted, what are the socioeconomic issues, how is it impacting employment. There are a lot of requirements that are talking about the impact on Utah as a society in general. And so we're not just gathering information from the locals on damage numbers, but we're also doing research on, what's the population of that community? What are some of the other issues that might be going on? Maybe it's a community that is already being affected by high unemployment rates due to other things. Damage declarations or disaster declarations can also be approved if you have other things happening at the same time. So when we were writing both the Magna and the windstorm, we had to write a lot of information about how COVID was also currently impacting what was happening. So if we'd had one of these events or a smaller event outside of other disasters, it might not get declared federally. But if we can justify, provide the information, provide the data, and explain why we need the federal assistance, then we have a better chance of getting individual assistance approved and some of those smaller disasters approved as well. And then another thing about why we are asking for the information so quickly, I know a lot of times we ask and they're like, well, we don't have that or we don't have it written down. That can be a challenge in a lot of ways, especially if you're not documenting or tracking what your damages are or what resources you're using as it's happening. It's really hard to go back later and find that information after the fact. You forget exactly what it was, how many things happened. And one of the things we often say when it comes to federal grants is if it wasn't written down, it didn't happen. If you don't have something to show what you are actually doing, it's hard to provide the documentation for that. And so we try to work with communities ahead of time to discuss the fact that, if you're not tracking your equipment, if you're not tracking your internal resources, we can help you set up a system to make it easier to track that. When it comes to the documentation, FEMA doesn't have a specific, they have tools you can use. There's no specific spreadsheets. There's no specific, you have to use this form. In general, it's you need to provide this level of data. And so you have a lot of flexibility in setting up your employee tracking materials, how you're documenting those things, as long as you're capturing the right data. And then can we choose not to track or provide the information requested during damage assessments? We've been asked this several times as well. So yes, as a city, a county, a private resident, you have the autonomy to choose not to track or provide information on damages. But there are some consequences to that. So the first one is if we're not counting your damages and you're not contributing your information to the damage assessments the state is doing to try and justify a federal disaster request, we might not meet the thresholds. A lot of our disasters, we're really close to meeting or not meeting the threshold. And if there's one community that's not providing that information, we could have potentially met it, but we might not if we don't have that data. And you know, sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't. And so it helps us to know the big picture so that we can justify that declaration and bring those resources in. And then if you're not documenting as you go along, if you're not choosing to track that, you might not have the documentation necessary to apply for disaster assistance grant programs if they're made available. So if you're not doing it in the moment when we're doing the damage assessment, and then a couple months later FEMA comes in, the grants are approved, you're then gonna have to go back and figure out all your costs and damages later. And it's just a lot easier if you have it available right away in the moment. There's a lot of information we miss when we do damage assessments. It's really hard to capture everything. Often it's residential damages are what's really hard to keep track of. After the earthquake, months later, even now, I'm getting calls from people who said that they had damages and they need assistance. But because they either chose not to or weren't aware that they needed to provide that damage information to their local community or to the state at the time, they missed out on the opportunity to provide the individual assistance that came out later. Also, sometimes after small disasters, we'll think there's not any individual assistance or people's homes weren't damaged enough to get a declaration. And then months later, they'll reach out to us at the state and ask, hey, I had all this damage I'm trying to fix. Is there assistance? And it was like, oh, we didn't know there was this level of damage at the time within that 30-day deadline that we had. And so we weren't able to justify requesting individual assistance. And so sometimes we look back and it's like, oh, we probably could have justified individual assistance, but we weren't aware that there were those residential damages. And so it's difficult to capture it all in the moment. It's difficult to provide it, but it's essential grant programs and to justify them. And then I'm going to go over some damage resources. So we know it's a pain. I hate having to bother people in the middle of damage operations and ask for information, but we want to try to simplify it. We want to try to make damage assessments easier, to provide resources that you guys can use, educate you on ways to simplify the process and help make it less painful as we work through it. And I know that our GIS team has presented at one of these I Wonder series. They talked about the mapping, the ArcGIS mapping tools and other tools they're putting in place to help you guys do damage assessments and surveys and inventories. We're partnering with them as well to try and coordinate between what we know is required for these grant programs to be in damage assessments and the tools that they're setting up. I'm going to go over some resources here that you guys can use to find out information to help you with damage assessments. Some of this, the first ones I'll talk about will be the guidance information available from FEMA on what's required to do damage assessments and to get those programs approved. And then also talk about the state resources we're coordinating with other partners in the state and with you guys to make available. So the first one is the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide. So this is the one we always refer to. It's called the PAPA-G. That is the guidance from FEMA on how the public assistance program works, what's required for their documentation, what you have to turn in. It is a very large document, but this is where you'll go to get information. This wasn't just written for us at the state who manage the programs. It was written for local governments, anyone who's going to be working in public assistance, trying to get public assistance and do damage assessments. So it's a very long document. As you can see, it's 277 pages. But luckily, in this online PDF version, all of these chapter heads are hyperlinked. So if you come to this document and you come to the table of contents and you're like, great, they have a chapter on preliminary damage assessments and declaration requests, presidential declarations, and this talks about, the evaluations we have to do at the state before we can submit them, what's required for us to put in those damages or declarations. Recipient is the state, so local entities are called subrecipients or applicants. So the recipient is the state, and this is all the administrative requirements we have to do at our level. But if you want to come look at the damage assessment information, you can just click on that and it will take you to that chapter. It's really nice that you can do that and click through. You can also search by keyword. So this is what we do a lot when we're trying to look something up or verify if we're correct on a policy. Open the document. If you hit Control F on your keyboard, the little search box comes up and you can type in volunteers. It shows you, the 3 places in here that volunteers are mentioned, and you can scroll through the arrows. It will take you right to those references or, donated resources. That's the category or the wording that FEMA uses when they talk about volunteers and other activities. And so you can click on this, take you right to that chapter, or if you have donated resources up here, you can click through the entire document and find all the places that it mentions donated resources. Great tool, not easy to navigate, but there are some tips and tricks for doing that. Another tool is this individual assistance guide. So it's the same thing as the Pda, but it talks about individual assistance programs. So again, same resource. This one, unfortunately, is not, oh, they did hyperlink it. They just don't have it blue. Great. Hyperlinked, and then you can use the search box as well. And this is where you get into the nitty-gritty details. If you want to know what's eligible, what activities are eligible, what type of documentation do I have to supply, all of that's listed in the Pda. There's also a preliminary damage assessment guide that's put out by FEMA, and that talks about PDAs is the acronym we use, preliminary damage assessments. It covers both IA and PA stuff, the process, what you have to put in your individual assistance assessments, public assistance assessments. So this is a great tool for that. Again, same thing, hyperlinks and Control F to find. There's also a pocket guide, so it's a condensed version. Not as many pages. This one's only 20 pages, whereas this one's 127. So if you just want a quick reference, this is a shorter one. And then also a Pda Fact Sheet. So they made some changes to the damage assessment guide in 2020. This just summarizes the changes they made. So if you were familiar with the previous guide, it's just 2 pages. It says this is kind of what we've changed and updated over this last year. And then finally, our resources and what we're trying to do to help you guys in the process. So if you go to DEM's homepage, currently now that we have disasters going on, right at the very top of that homepage, we have information about the disasters that have happened in 2020. So we've had 3 presidential declarations. We've got the COVID declaration, the Magna earthquake, and the windstorm. We also have a public assistance page on here. It's kind of buried underneath our programs in here. If you go to hazard mitigation, click through. It always takes me a while to find it. See, even I'm having trouble. It's in here. But to make that easy, we have a link for it right here on the homepage. So if you click here, it'll go to the public assistance page. Same information on the front, but we talk about, for public assistance specifically, use grants portal. These are the disaster numbers for currently active disasters, and then helpful resource links. And one of the resources we're working on, and this is what I'm want to work with you guys on and get your feedback on as we're developing it, is what we're calling our hub sites. So during the September wind event, we knew the event was coming. We're in the middle of working the earthquake and COVID, so we were kind of already in response and recovery mode. And so our GIS team had shared with us recently that we had these resources we could use in the ArcGIS system, which is the mapping, where we could set up kind of little simple, basic websites. And we can get in and edit them, add stuff to them. They can be a bit dynamic and have information updated in real time. So we started sharing damage assessment information right away because we knew that debris was going to be a big issue. And we want to make sure everyone kind of knew what they should be tracking and what they should be doing and the stuff that they would need to deal with the debris and to try and get federal funding for it. So we worked with them to set up a hub site very quickly after the disaster. We also later sent one up for Magna earthquake when individual assistance became available, and then, well, now that public assistance is available. So these are a work in progress. The link is right here. They're also on the homepage. And our plan is to develop basically a template, non-disaster specific page. So it'll be on here, but it'll just be on disaster recovery and damage assessments. And we'll have a homepage with information and then several tabs to cover topics. There's a lot on here that are missing that we want to put in. So we have damage reporting, we have a page on donated resources, public assistance application process, public assistance eligibility. So the windstorm doesn't have individual assistance, so we don't have information on that up here, but if it did, we would have added a tab for individual assistance. But on the generic template page, we're gonna have all of those on there. Anything you wanna know about damage assessments and disaster recovery and declarations, we're gonna create a page for that. And then when we have a disaster event that happens, we'll take that page as a template and then create a disaster specific page like we have for the windstorm and the earthquake. We'll get that set up quickly. You can go there for information, for resources. A lot of the mapping tools that Josh spoke about previously and survey tools that we can share with you, he'll link those to those pages so you can go there and find them, use them. If you don't have a system set up at your county for individuals to report damages to you, we can help you get that set up. We can also add the links to our state page here. So if people are looking to report home damages, they can go to the right place to report them. And then as we work through the disaster process, the homepage will highlight where we are. So the damage assessment, we had an initial one, disaster first happened, first couple days, we do that. Then if we decide this is a big event, we'll probably get a FEMA declaration. We do a joint PDA, which is where we start sharing our damage information with FEMA and with SBA to get the declarations. And then the request, and then this will go along the timeline and help you know where we are in the process. Right now, the disaster programs are available, so we have, this is what you need to do to apply. When we were doing damage assessments or the declaration, we had information down here on that. And then you'll have these pages to go to up here for extra information and resources. Like I said, these ones are not fully developed because we've been figuring them out as we go. They're kind of the disaster pages we've been testing and just adding information as we have it. But what we're hoping is on these pages, instead of you having to pull up that Papa G or that individual assistance guide or go out and find the resources you need and the information, you can come here. And we'll have a page on damage reporting. Where can we report our damages? What's the stuff that you need to know? And then we have these resources pages. So on this one, we focus specifically on the damage assessments and then also debris removal, because we knew with the windstorm, debris was going to be a large issue. And so we have the fact sheets and the resources, debris removal tips from FEMA. All of these are on here. And then the guidance on debris removal, it's in the Papa G, but we can bring out pieces of it. So we've copied stuff out here. Like we know if you're doing private property debris removal, we've taken this out of the guidance and summarized it here instead of you having to go find it. Documenting labor, materials, and equipment. This is in that Papa G, the Public Assistance Policy Guide, and we've outlined it's on pages 65 and 80 through 86. And then we just took out some highlights on if you want to claim your labor, materials, or equipment, this is what they're going to ask for if they come for the grant, to provide the grant. So this is the type of stuff you should be keeping track of as you're doing repairs or moving the debris or any of that other stuff. And so instead of you having to just always go to that big long document, you can come to the site and we're going to try and highlight what the important things are you need to pay attention to and remember about that guidance as you work through that specific disaster. So we want some feedback on this. What information are we missing? As we work on right now we're kind of still in the recovery response mode. And so these are just with what's been relevant to those. But as we work on that larger template for, that will then be the template for all future sites and for the non-disaster time site, we'd love to get your feedback on that. If there's something that you can't find, if it's too hard to navigate, we want to know. We want that feedback, and we want to make this a useful tool for you so that going forward, anytime a disaster happens and the state's involved and you like, I need information, I need this, how do I do this? You just know to go to these hub sites, and they're there to provide the links to all the resources and other places you can go for information. So one of the one of the challenges we also had, and it keeps coming to mind, but I keep trying to find the right place to put it, is a challenge we had with a recent flooding disaster that we had. And part of why we also are trying to get this information out to you guys ahead of time and help you develop damage assessment tools for gathering not only your public assistance damages, but your residential damages is we were working recently with St. George on their flooding event they had that happened it was either right before or right after the windstorm. It was before, it was in August. And as we were working on that damage assessment with them, they gathered some information initially from residents. But then through that initial information, we found out we weren't going to be able to do, as we worked on it over the next couple days and weeks, they realized they weren't going to be able to utilize the FEMA public assistance, but we could do an SBA declaration. SBA has some different data requirements than FEMA does for their damages. And so the city tried to go back and contact the residents who had provided them information initially on the damages. Unfortunately, because so many weeks had passed, there were a lot that were either non-responsive, or when they did call and talk to them, when they found out that they weren't going to qualify for FEMA grants, or they were just frustrated with having to deal with damages to their home, they didn't want to provide the additional information that was needed. And so that's a big challenge in anything. It's harder for you guys to provide additional information we ask, and it's hard for residents to want to. And so we're trying to make it so that when you're collecting information initially, it's simple, and it's also all the information that we're going to need up front, especially when collecting it from residents, so that then you don't have to chase them down and ask them again later and delay the process. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to try to work within what's required, but work with you guys to make it work in a way that is good for you and your communities. So I'm going to stop here. Sorry, I've nonstop talking for the last half hour, but I'm done with the slides. I'm going to go back to my presentation here, and we can have some discussion. I'm also going to ask you guys some questions. Questions that we often get about what's required for this, or what do I have to track, or how do I know this? And you guys are going to go use the resources I've just shared. Tracy's been sharing the links in the chat to find that. So think of some questions you have, and we're going to answer. But right now, Tracy, I don't know the best way to have them reply. If you want them, just type it in the chat, or just say they've found it. But if you wanted to know where to find what you need to track for donated resources, where would you go to find that? And once you know that, I'm going to ask another question and have you actually go look it up.
So Chris Blindinger has his hand up, so we can go to him. Looks like he put it in the chat. Do you want to go ahead, Chris?
Yeah, that was not an answer for that was an answer for where do you find it, because I have no idea. But it was more about digging deeper into the declaration process.
Yeah.
But if we need to get through these questions, we can come back to me, if however you want to do it.
Yeah, I would say let's just do these two quick questions so that we can show that you guys are interacting with what we're sharing and know how to use the resources I've just shared. And then I'm here to answer any and all questions, so as best I can. So I've just shared these resources. So there's the PAPA-G that's available, the individual assistance, there's the hub sites that I just talked about. If you, as a local EM, or even us at the state, wanted to know what we needed to track for donated resources or for volunteer hours, what of those resources could you use? And maybe it's hard to answer because it's an obvious, like here's your list. But if anyone could type, which of these resources could you use for that? See if I can pull up the chat so I can see what's going on. Nobody wants to answer. All right, I'll answer for this one. So if you wanted to know what donated resources you could claim or use, or you need to keep track of with your volunteer hours, because you can use those as an offset when the grants come into play. Donations can be used to offset the cost. You can go to the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide, because in there it talks all about donated resources. And so if I click on here, look on this chapter heading, I go down, applications. This is where you can find information about who's eligible for public assistance, what activities are eligible, what entities are eligible, damage and impact information, cost eligibility. And it's like, oh, it's taking forever to scroll through here. So I'm just going to do this, Control F, my donated resources. Great. I'm going to go to donated resources and find out what this is about. Okay, wonderful. This is who can donate. You can count them if they were donated by these people, offset amounts, documentation requirements for donated resources is right here in this Papa G. So it lists what you need to do. Also, we've put that information on the hub site. So if you come up to your donated resources tab on the hub site, we talk about tracking volunteers. This is where you go to find out about what's required for volunteers and equipment. And then we've taken that list of what's required in documentation and summarized it here at the bottom. So now that you guys know where to find that, what do you have to track for volunteers or people's time for donated resources? So you know where you can look it up. If you guys will go look it up and people can start listing in the chat, what's one thing that you need to keep track of when you're tracking volunteer hours?
And Chris Blindinger has put some of that information in the chat, their name, what they did, and where they did it.
Great.
We also just want to remind everyone that this is the part of the presentation that is the hands-on portion. So if you're wanting to count this as a workshop for your EMPG credit, this is where you are earning that credit.
So you guys can click on those links and go to either the Papa G or that hub site that she put in the that Tracy put in the chat and just find on there. So if you're tracking your volunteer, what's something that you have to have? Yep, so I see Austin said phone number. So contact information, that's good for you guys to follow up with them. The amount of time they spent. I don't know, Tracy, maybe I should have had this a poll question.
Yeah, people sometimes like to be anonymous in their responses, just in case they get it wrong.
Well, can we do a raise a hand? So if you clicked
Sure.
on one of those resources and actually looked up what's required, raise your hand. Oh, Chris is saying the links aren't working. Well, you can't
Oh.
use it on my presentation, but I think Tracy put them in the chat. So you'd have to go up in the chat and click on the link in the chat.
Sorry, I've been drinking.
You're good. Woohoo, someone raised their hand. I'll put it this way, to make me feel better for all the time that I'm spending trying to put these hub sites together as a resource, just knowing that you clicked on that link to go look at it makes it worth it. So you can raise it
sure.
and then lower it.
I think the fact that you put those on the disaster specific sites is so helpful because you went up to that drop down and there was a donations link right there.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to try to do, and also, you know, make it so that you guys can have links to, you know, if you want to use our ArcGIS resources or surveys or forms, we're going to try to make these useful. Yeah, as I say, it's not worth my time and energy and efforts and heart to build these if they're not going to be useful to you guys. So we definitely want to work hard to make sure that they're a tool that helps you. So okay, well, I guess I didn't see how many hands went up. Hopefully some did. Hopefully everyone's been able to find the links, click on them. Again, to find any of these resources that are shared in the slideshow, we'll share them, obviously. Tracy will share them with the information after the presentation. But if you go to DEM's website, that's the easiest one to remember, dem.utah.gov. Right there on the homepage, there's a link to those hub sites that you can go play around on them, look at them, see where the information is, and then give us feedback on how it is. It's good, it's not, we like this, we don't like this, and we'll continue to work on making those better. Okay, so I guess if Tracy's good, we can move on to questions.
Go ahead, Chris.
All right.
Uh, we got the news today that the governor has signed the Drought Declaration. Are you
Mm-hmm.
going to be putting together a page for this? As I reached out to our waters guy, understanding what wells we've had go dry because of this, and what they're having to do to recover those wells. It's very expensive, and I wonder how that applies, or how just caught me off guard, the Drought Declaration. I think that's a lot of communities impacted, but
Yeah.
um,
So drought is a tricky one, because it's kind of a longer term elusive disaster, as opposed to some of the more immediate ones that happen up front. So we currently, and I'll look into it, I think we've looked into it before. We had a statewide drought declaration a couple of years ago as well. Most of the drought resources come from agencies outside of FEMA. So it's, my brain's not working. I've forgotten all my acronyms.
Agriculture.
Thank you. Yes, it's like Department of Ag and some of the other federal agencies. They're the ones that have a lot more resources for drought as far as when a declaration is made. They're the agencies that tend to respond to drought with their resources. But FEMA does have drought is listed as one of the options for mitigation grants. So we don't really have any recovery grants for drought specifically. FEMA doesn't generally deploy and come out with their programs due to a drought. But if you're looking at options for mitigation to help mitigate drought that is happening, you can apply for funding through BRIC or through, I believe it's also through our HMGP. They tend to have the same categories, but not always. I'll double check on that. But drought is a disaster in there you can mitigate against. And some of the things that they look at are things like groundwater recharge, other things like that, where you're trying to, recharge your groundwater, have better water resources available, reduce your water use so that you're not wasting any water resources on necessary items. And so I would say follow up with us so that we can specifically talk with you about what you need to do or would like to do and help you find the right channel for a resource for that. And yeah, you raised your hand again, Chris.
yeah, you said that groundwater recharge. I'd never heard of that before, but a couple of years ago, our city started filling the aquifer. Were taking these
Mm-hmm.
actions to fill the aquifer, which I think is something that's awesome that they had the forethought to start doing that. But we do currently have 3 wells that are pumping dry stuff. They're pumping
Yeah.
air, that they've got to do something to get them down to a level where they can pump water. So I do need to reach out to you, I think. And I
Okay.
had sent an email to Cameron earlier today, so maybe with him included in that, we can talk about that.
Yeah. No, that's great. We'll follow up with you. Anyone else have any questions on damage assessments?
Jana, is it better to um, have specific people already trained in doing damage assessments before a disaster comes? Are there specific agencies within a city or county that usually help perform these damage assessments?
I think there are training specific people is difficult because, as we know, there's turnover. And if you only have one person that knows how to do it and then that person's gone, you've lost that knowledge. But definitely there are partnerships and people within communities. So we work with the emergency managers, and emergency managers are kind of like we are between the state and FEMA. Is you're kind of the middleman. You have to get all the information from the communities and the locals, and then coordinate with us on getting information up to us. Um, but often when we're doing damage assessments and tracking, some of the biggest challenges we have is training public works people. The people who are actually dealing with the damages firsthand are usually the ones that need to, they're the ones that are doing the tracking and letting you know what the damages are. And so it's great for our emergency managers to be trained so that they know what type of information they should be gathering and what they need to, to help the counties and the cities know, like, yes, we should do public, but we also should set something up so that we're collecting residential damages because we could also get a declaration for that. Um, but then it is a challenge if your public works directors or your city administrators or your city finance people, they don't have things set up to track that type of information or to provide it. And so that is, I think, something that we want to work on is helping those agencies and those departments to set up just their already set internal processes to make it easier so they don't have to do anything extra in a disaster. So
Thanks, Jenna. And I'll add a plug here for those that are interested. We can help you create an exercise where you're just doing that part of um, emergency management, where we're declaring a disaster and going out and doing damage assessments and not doing the full from start to finish. What do we need to do to get through this disaster? But let's just focus on just the declaration and just getting a damage assessment done and trying that process and getting the training in the right hands within your community. So if that's something you're interested, you can always reach out to our training and exercise section as well. Any other questions for Jenna?
either they've all fallen asleep or I've just answered all their questions and they don't have any more. They're all going to do perfect damage assessments next time.
I think your sites are very thorough, Jenna. So I'm sure that they're just appreciative of all of the resources. All right.
Okay.
Well, with that, thank you, Jenna, for your presentation today. As a reminder, this webinar and all other webinars in this series will be available on the DEM website at dem.utah.gov/exercises or now at dem.utah.gov/iwonder. Our webinar next week will be I Wonder How I Can Identify Critical Infrastructure in My Jurisdiction, presented by Braden Norris, our Critical Infrastructure Specialist. And if you have any I Wonder topic suggestions, please reach out to tbodley@utah.gov to have your topic added to our calendar. We're always excited to help you explore and get to know all that DEM can offer the emergency management community. Until next time, keep wondering.